So the second speaker is Daniel Sanz from the University of Warsaw. The presentation is going to be about the clustering of information structural properties. So whenever you're ready, we can start.
Thanks. Is my presentation showing correctly?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dana, for the introduction there. It's nice to have a bit of contiguity between presentations from Begonia's on to mine. In fact, I'll be talking about something like the same issues, however, from a much broader and a much wider perspective of the general problems with information structural approaches that do not take issues such as processing, effort, and considerations of relevance into consideration. So what I'd like to, one second, let me see, get this moving. Generally, what is information structure? What are the underlying intuitions? Is first what I'm going to start with. Then I'm going to talk about some reasons why some of the fundamental assumptions in the whole field are likely wrong from the relevance theoretic perspective. And to sketch out in a small amount of time an alternative view based on relevance theory that offers some advantages. The one question is, why do these various properties that are used to define information structure categories cluster the way that they do? So with that in mind, we start from the very beginning. Information structure has been studied for at least 200 years in various forms and approaches. Generally, the intuition is that utterances consist of at least two, maybe more types of content. And probably the most theory neutral way of describing that is new information versus old information. For instance, I have 4 examples here, very simple, with simple pitch accents kind of marked there. John likes broccoli. With the hoe, Steve tilled the garden. That's an example drawn from the Prague school literature. On Wednesdays, I play bridge, with a kind of contrastive Wednesdays. And if her party wins, Susan will become Minister of Education. Now, with those simple utterances, with context we can imagine, of course, we're playing the analyst game here, we can try to see if we mark in bold the things that kind of seem like the old information-y things. So John in the first, with the hoe in the second, on Wednesdays in the third, and if her party wins. And if we kind of try to identify what are the new information-y things, let's start pre-theoretically here, we end up with the all caps, the broccoli, the garden, the bridge, the education, these 2 things. Now, these are fairly uncontroversial analyses. However, what I want to dig at is what's going on, what are the intuitions that are getting us to this point, right? But starting here, where do most, let's say, contemporary theories of information structure take this? Well, these days, most generative and functional approaches rely on what are called information structure categories. Here I've drawn up an analyses in sort of along the lines of Knut Lambrecht's influential work, where there's 2 categories. There's a category of topic and there's a category of focus. They are marked in the syntax, and that carries through into the semantics, and that carries through into some kind of pragmatic interpretation. And these are marked, these are categories, these are psychologically real and cognitively real and linguistically real categories, entities. And so we have John marked as a topic in the first, with the hoe marked as a topic, on Wednesdays marked as a topic, perhaps contractive topic in the third, and so on. Whereas the focus, I believe this is the sort of the definition of focus that Begonia was working on, essentially some element which contains the main pitch accent, the main focal stress, as it's called. So if you read many sort of beginning textbooks of semantics and pragmatics, it would seem that we have this sussed out, that this is pretty much sealed and cut and dried, and that's well understood. However, let's go back to Levinson in 1983, who in his pragmatics book argued that this field is really just a mess. There's terminological profusion and confusion, as he called it. It's a famous quote. Plagued the field to where little may be salvageable. He argued that, it's 50 years ago, just 10 years ago, Jeanette Gundel also agreed, things are not getting any better. And in fact, even more recently, you can find many influential theoreticians arguing that the field is really not converging so well. And despite at least 50 years of serious work trying to formalize these notions. Now, these days, there's an idea that perhaps there's a good reason for that, right? So what are the two problems? In terms of terminological profusion, of course, many of you will know that there's many different terms that have been proposed in the literature, not just topic and focus that I'm talking about, but the deeper problem is not just the labels. The deeper problem is the properties that are used to define those labels. So here are a list of 8 properties, five of which have typically been used or posited as the way to define the old side. So in terms of aboutness or linear position, in terms of givenness, in terms of adversation or frame setting, I'll explain what those are in a moment. And 3 which are predominantly used to define what's the new side, what's the focus side. So intonational prominence, presence of alternatives, or some sort of notion of development. And each of these has had, through 150 years of literature, their own proponents, individuals who've tried to posit these as the main definitional properties of these putative information structural categories. Aboutness is probably the biggest way of defining topics or themes or whatever you want to call them, the old information. And sometimes there are some very clear intuitions, right? In the case of John is sleeping, we're saying about John that he is sleeping, right? There's only one argument, a subject argument in this proposition. So it's fairly clear that that's probably the intuition of aboutness. But it's been very clear since at least Jespersen in 1924 that anytime there are more arguments involved, that there are many more intuitions of what something is about. So John promised Mary a gold ring is about at least every referential expression, if not about many more things. So there have been appeals made to an argument hierarchy that a sentence like John promised Mary a gold ring is about John more than it's about Mary because John is the subject and that ties into topic continuity and so on. But this definitional property of what is a topic or what is a theme fails because it can be overridden by other factors. For example, in the example there, John promised Mary a gold ring. This is about the ring that John promised to Mary. It asserts that it is gold. So aboutness intuitions are multifarious, complex. There's many philosophical discussions about them, and they don't really work very well as definitional properties for what is a topic, what is a theme, and so on and so forth. Next. Linear position has been tried as a definitional property. Basically, what comes first in the sentence in the Hallidayan tradition. The theme is what comes first in the clause. It's the thing that the information begins with. Early Chomsky, more recent cartographic approaches are based on the idea that a topic or a theme is something positional, right? So John saw the play yesterday. Sometimes the intuitions are less clear. In John saw the play yesterday, clearly John would be the most topic-y kind of thing here. But when we have competition between yesterday, John saw the play, or the play John saw yesterday, it's unclear whether the subjectness of John makes it more about or more topic-y than the play, and so yesterday, and there's sort of conflicting approaches to this in the literature. Again, givenness has been tried in the last 20, 30 years as a definitional property for information structure categories. Sometimes, again, we have clear intuitions. My friend got married, right? In simple case studies, simple artificial toy examples, as Begonia might put it, this thing works very well. But for example, if we have an example like a friend of mine got married to Britney Spears. Britney Spears is clearly much more given, much more salient than the friend of mine, and yet the friend of mine is in some sense more topic-y than Britney Spears. So you can see where I'm heading at here, that these different definitional properties sometimes point in different directions, sometimes point in the same direction. Another example from the Czech literature, an unknown man has asked him the way to the railway station. Now, an unknown man is the subject and is kind of topic-y. As a result of that, it's also the initial phrase, but he is the most referentially salient individual in this, or entity in this entire sentence. So these categories start to point in different directions. Adversation has been tried by a number of authors working on sort of the file cards approach or metaphor for the way cognitive architecture works. And sometimes, again, there's clear intuitions. John loves broccoli. Clearly, this is about John, and it's something we need to file away under John as a concept. Or for my birthday, I want to go to Barcelona. You could argue that this is opening up a file about my birthday and entering information about Barcelona. But typically, oftentimes there are subjects or topics or themes which don't really seem to serve very well as files. For example, each 19th century author is worthy of attention. Those are many different files. It's hard to imagine them being one file in some sense. So there's some criticism in the literature of the adversation approach too. Now and one last one about the topic or the topic or theme side. There's this notion that perhaps a topic or a theme should be viewed appropriately as a frame setter. So sometimes they have truth conditional. They make a truth conditional difference. They have an impact on the truth variability of the utterance. For example, as for education, John prefers Bertrand Russell's ideas. So John prefers only those ideas of Bertrand Russell's which deal with education. It's kind of a quantification over the context or the situations in which this can be truth valuable. English is spoken in the Shetlands versus in the Shetlands, English is spoken. Some of the Czech authors argue that that is clearly a truth conditional distinction between the two. From an RT perspective, we might argue that the difference in the scale of the quantifiers is more of a relevance based, but that's the way they argue it. But sometimes it's unclear that something which is argued to be a topic or a theme has anything to do with frame setting. For example, our simple example, John likes broccoli. John is not setting any frame or affecting the truth valuability of that utterance. So those are 5 different ways that the topic side has been attempted to be defined. There's 3 ways I'd like to talk about that the focus side of the information divide has been defined. Intonational prominence is of course the big one and the main one that's still around. Sometimes there's clear intuitions. I play bridge, but sometimes not. On Wednesdays I play bridge. We have 2 intonational prominences. They seem to be working in 2 different directions. Halliday's originally work called them both foci. These days they might be called a contrastive foci, or they might be called a contrastive focus. So intonational prominence is not a clear-cut way of defining what is a focus and what is not. And of course, there's the phenomenon of second occurrence focus, which I won't get into, but there are sometimes cases where there seems to be focus without intonational prominence. So. Next, another of the big ways of defining focus is based on alternatives through the work of Max Ruth. Sorry, there's some clear intuitions that when we have an utterance such as John likes broccoli with a focus, let's call it on likes, we have what Ruth will call the traditional, the standard semantic value, which is the utterance, the proposition John likes broccoli, but also the special focus value, which includes all alternatives to the element that is under focus. But as has been repeatedly noted in the literature, there are sometimes cases where we have an intuition about focus, or at least there's some intonational prominence, where there does not seem to be any clear set of alternatives that's evoked or required for interpretation. Bollinger talked about this in the 60s. Let's have a picnic, as opposed to what exactly? Anything else we could possibly be doing? Or the introduction of a story that someone just told me recently. A friend of mine was once woken up by a terrible racket. Now, there seems to be some sort of focus and topic distinctions there, but there aren't any clear alternatives because there isn't any background information to be alternative against in that case. And a last one, the more recently, well, from the Czechs, there was an idea that maybe information structure is all about the development of the communication. This was the communicative dynamism. And I see that modern QUD approaches is kind of a resuscitation of that in some sense, that the idea of all communication and the idea of every utterance is to move forward in some way the common goal of approaching ever closer to some communicative finale. And sometimes there are some clear intuitions, right? What is a topic and what is a theme can be seen to set up a discourse move, and then what is the RHEME or the focus can be seen as completing it. For example, to my surprise, the presentation went well, or much to the delight of the children, the bus came. In each of these cases, the utterance seems in 2 clauses to be setting up and also resolving a discourse move. Or let's say sometimes in defense of the QUD approach, it's very useful to analyze cases like this. So how's your grandpa is asking an explicit question. Physically, he's coping very well. What the physically is doing is dividing the question under discussion into sub-questions and addressing only one of them, leaving the other one open, possibly for addressing in a later utterance. Or even independently, on Wednesdays, I play bridge. Tying back into the alternatives, this could be seen as opening up a sub-question to what I do in general and answering only one portion, and therefore opening up the alternative to be addressed later. But not always. Again, let's go back to our simple example. John likes broccoli. This John seems to be a topic or a theme, but there doesn't seem to be actually doing any development or working in that direction unless it's set within a kind of a question and answer scenario prior to that. So what do we end up with? This is the review of literature I've been doing for a long time. We end up with, as you can see on the left-hand side, there's a whole pile of different features that have been used in the information structure literature, each of them held up by certain authors as the answer to the question of how do we know what is on the one side and how do we know what is on the other side. These are semantic features, temporal features, prosodic features, cognitive features, and discourse features. I've kind of classified them. And as such, they really don't seem to be very they don't seem to be expectable or very comfortable bedfellows, right? These are things from very different worlds being put together. So let me give you an example. How about John? What does he like? Well, John likes broccoli. Let's keep that as our example with the stress on broccoli. I've listed the 8 different categories here, and you can see that there's kind of a cline between John, which has a whole bunch of different topic-y kind of properties, likes, which has a bit of both on each side, and broccoli, which has more of the focusy kind of properties on each side. These days, it seems that old and new, let's call them, are best viewed as sets of features of disparate types which tend to co-occur, and that gives rise to an intuition that there are generally 2 different kinds of content. But these things that are being identified as by linguists as topic, themes, and foci RHEMEs have a certain bundle of these features, but no single definition has yet succeeded. Why? Because no single definition can be successful. Instead, it seems that the research program in most of the field of information structure is doomed to failure, and this is the line of argumentation that's being put forward in the work of Daniel Wedgwood, also Pavel Ozerov, and a couple of other, I would say, brilliant theorists that whose work I tried to draw upon. So getting back to our initial examples, if I may. If we say that John likes broccoli, how do we know that, on what basis are we labeling John as the old information? Well, something to do with salience, something to do with initial position, something to do with being unmarked prosodically. How do we know that broccoli is the focus here? Something to do with late position, something to do with intonational prominence. However, if we move on, for example, to number 2, it seems that it's more about position in number 3. Position also plays a part, but there's also intonational prominence that's also confounding the original kind of intuition of what is the topic here. And in number 4, if her party wins, this kind of idea of marking whole clauses as topics versus whole clauses as focus in the work of Hyman draws on the idea of frame setting. So if her party wins, this is a frame in which the remainder of the remainder of the utterance can be truth or valuable. So you can see that even in these simple examples, you end up with various pieces of these different definitions coming together. However, it is undeniable that these properties tend to coincide in certain ways, and that's what gives us, at least linguists, if not native speakers of any language, but us as linguists, intuition that there is something as such as a topic and there is something such as a focus. The right question in the field is not, therefore, which feature offers the right definition, but rather, why do these features cluster the way they do? And with that, I'll have to just conclude with this slide that I think, given most of our, I assume, ideas concerning understanding of relevance theory, you won't be surprised if I say that the topic-like features tend to co-occur I would say, and this is what I'd like to argue, but I won't have time to do it in detail, because they play into, broadly speaking, the process of context selection. And this is where RT has the advantage in talking about information structure, because it views context selection as an active process, context construction as a process that is underway as utterance interpretation is still online. So it is good for topic-y like things, which help in context selection to come early, to be, they don't need to be prosodically stressed. It's good for them to be already salient in the context. It's sometimes we have an impression that they are a kind of a file in which we're supposed to store the information that comes in the cognitive effects. And sometimes it helps us prepare a discourse move. And on the other side, things which are themey or RHEME or focus-like have to do with what is being predicated, what applies within the frame that the context has established. It's in late position because of considerations of processing effort. It bears main stress because main stress is a signal of cognitive effects ripe for the taking. Sometimes there's alternatives because in anticipatory processing, we're always entertaining alternatives. And sometimes we get the impression that what is the focus is attaining of a goal or closing a discourse move, because that is what the intention of the speaker is. So more generally speaking, what I'm arguing for is the only way to make sense of the mess and the terminological profusion and confusion, to quote Levinson in the field 50 years ago, is to take an RT line and to analyze each case in terms of processing effort versus cognitive effects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Begonia, please.
Thanks very much for your talk, Daniel. You've got me a bit confused at the end when I was sort of looking forward to how you were going to approach what you were going to, how relevance theory sorts out the mess. And you could say that everything is about context selection, but you said the topichood is about context selection. And my understanding is that that's focus in relevance theory, that the topichood would give you the background of assumptions that you already have, I suppose. And focus is telling you to activate assumptions connected with that kind of material. So context selection would be more appropriately predicated of focus, I would say, than of context. Where focus is identified by the assumption schema, where you get the background inferences and the and forward inferences. I don't know. Unless we say that everything is about context selection, which it is, I suppose, could we not make a clearer distinction between topic and focus in relevance theory? No.
Thanks for the comment, and I regret that I didn't leave myself enough time to actually develop more the RT. I was more setting the scene for quite a bit of it. You're right in the sense that context selection, right, is a never-ending in RT, especially in a kind of a dynamic approach. It's a never-ending process. So tailoring the context or the hypothetical context or the set of contexts that are being entertained is underway all the way through utterance interpretation. However, if we take, for example, if we, for example, call sort of like C0, like a sort of a default context that sort of a set of mentally activated assumptions and concepts that are present in the hearer's cognitive environment right before processing begins. Then we have some idea of salience, right? That's where salience kind of comes in, right? If you're familiar with, for example, Sperber and Wilson's sketch in the original Relevance book about online processing, they argue that old information, as they're calling it, or background information, comes first because it behooves the hearer, it behooves the speaker to let the hearer access an appropriate context at early enough time, and in order not to waste time considering the context. Right? And in that sense, that's where I'm linking topicality to context selection. However, you have a good point in the sense that the context so I think maybe the more, the strictest relevance theoretic sense is the set of assumptions which plays a role as implicated premises in deriving cognitive effects. So in a sense, context is the springboard upon which we derive the cognitive effects, but it's the cognitive effects that verify whether something was actually in the intended context or not. So I think that it's what you're getting at is the parallel processing of both context and cognitive effects at the same time. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. It was interesting, this idea that focus tells you where it is worth dwelling for effects. So I think that it's important to emphasize that the role of focus, this marking intonationally, prosodically, and the cost that goes with it, is telling you here's where you should look for effects, which I found for scalar inference cancelability, derivability and cancelability works really better than these other accounts. Yeah, thanks. Thanks
for the comment, very much.
Oh, you're muted. Yeah.
Sorry, thanks, Kate. I just wanted to say that if there are no other questions, given that we have a few extra minutes, maybe Daniel, if you would like to actually take the time to briefly elaborate on what you mentioned at the beginning, at the end, sorry, concerning the role of cognitive effort and cognitive effects in contributing to context selection, and how this relates to the different properties that you discuss. Just to really conclude with a bit of an elaboration on the final points that you touch upon. You also have to unmute.
That's right. Thank you very much. Perhaps I can go back to the final slide then. One moment. Sent me to the lobby, I'm sorry. Is it showing?
No, unfortunately not. Oh, yes, now yes.
Okay, there we go. So here we have the list of these properties. The first light column on the left-hand side. So aboutness, frame setting, linear order. These are the kinds of properties that have been used to define information structure categories throughout the literature. So in terms of aboutness, in terms of setting a frame, in terms of linear order, in terms of prosodic providence, in terms of givenness, in terms of adversation, where to store something, in terms of the presence of alternatives, or the development and the preparation towards reaching a goal. Why do these things line up? Now, my contention is that our notions of topic and our notions of focus are essentially prototype notions that we understand that the properties that are in column 3 here tend to co-occur, and we usually get bundles of them together. And so that's what a topic-y kind of thing is. And the properties in column 4 tend to occur together, and they are the kind of focusy kind of things that we're used to. However, no matter which one of these we pick, we will always be able to find an example in which we have intuitions about old versus new information or topic versus focus, which nevertheless don't rely on that one specific property. Hence, we have to retreat to a prototype-based notion. But that, in turn, raises a question of why these things should pattern together. So why should it be the case that early position, for example, tends to co-occur with something that sets a frame? Or early position tends to occur with our intuitions of what something is about. And early position tends to co-occur with something which is unstressed, which something which is salient in the context prior to utterance processing, let's call it. It tends to co-occur with our intuitions of that this may be a file that we need to store something under. Typically, it does not involve relevant alternatives in the sense of Max Root's work. And it typically co-occurs with our intuitions of what is the discourse move. So it either sets up a move or it refers back to a question in sort of question-answer focus constructions. So, and the answer that I would like to argue for is that all of these properties are related to context selection and reducing the processing effort on the hearer's part in identifying a context. The earlier a context can be identified, the better, hence the early position. Setting a frame is also part of context selection. Of course, it's sort of some possible world which is being accessed. It's unstressed because stress has to do with either alternatives or deriving cognitive effects. It has to do with where to store something because it is a concept which has many pieces of information filed away together with it that are relevant to the processing, and it's good to access them sooner. And if it is preparation in the sense of referring back to some question under discussion, it's good to identify which question under discussion is being addressed earlier rather than later. To do the flip side, if I could also do that for one moment, then why do these properties tend to correlate together? Let's say, why does sentence stress typically fall, or contrasted stress typically fall, on something in late position that applies within the frame that's been identified? It's typically considered to be the assertions being made about something else, one earlier part. Why is it the thing that we're storing away under a concept? Why is it the thing that gives rise to relevant alternatives? And why a set of raises the manifestness of a set of relevant alternatives, let's call it. And why is it typically the part of the utterance that gives us the intuition that this is satisfying some goal, reaching some conclusion? And that is mainly because of the nature of what the sentence stress is. Sentence stress is a signal that that cognitive effects are ripe for the taking, as I've said. They're ready, they're there, they're more or less anticipatable at this stage of utterance processing. And that's why, in the RT perspective, all of these things tend to cluster together. And this is the genius, I would say, of the RT approach to information structure, is no one else gives us an explanation why so many theorists have tried to find the right definition and looked in completely different places. Why should these things even be comparable at all? Why should they fall together? That's essentially what I would like to say.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks
I think it was helpful. Thanks.